Johnny Cash did not become Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison. But Folsom turned him into the version of himself America would never forget. When most people picture Johnny Cash now, they see the same image. Black clothes, a hard face, a deep voice, a guitar hanging low across his body. And somewhere behind him, prison bars. That image feels so permanent now that it is easy to imagine it was always there. It was not. It had to be built. It had to be tested. And more than anything, it had to be proven in front of people who would never applaud a lie. The story begins years before the famous concert. In the early 1950s, Johnny Cash was a young Air Force serviceman stationed in Germany. Around that time, he saw a prison film called Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison. The title stayed with him. The feeling stayed with him even longer. Cash was always drawn to certain emotional landscapes: regret, confinement, punishment, the slow crawl of time, the ache of freedom when it exists somewhere close enough to imagine, but far enough away that you cannot touch it. That feeling eventually became Folsom Prison Blues. When Cash recorded the song in 1955, it immediately sounded different from almost everything around it. It was lean. It was dark. It was plain spoken. And then there was that line, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." It was shocking on purpose, cold, simple, unforgettable. The line made people stop. It made them listen. And it tied Johnny Cash to a world of prisons and moral wreckage that the public never quite let him leave. At first, that connection was mostly symbolic. Cash was not pretending to be an inmate. He was not claiming a life he had not lived. But he understood something about guilt, about failure, and about the long shadow of consequences. Over time, the prison connection became real. Cash began performing in prisons across the country, and he learned quickly that prison audiences were different from any other audience he had ever faced. They did not clap politely because a man was famous. They did not laugh because they were supposed to. They did not pretend to be moved when they were not. If they respected you, you felt it immediately. And if they did not, you felt that too. Cash liked that. He liked the lack of pretense. He liked the fact that in prison, performance had to earn its place. Nothing was handed to you in those rooms. That mattered to him because Johnny Cash, for all his fame, distrusted polish without truth. He distrusted fake piety. He distrusted surface emotion. He distrusted entertainment that floated above real life without ever touching it. And prison concerts forced him to touch something real. By the mid-1960s, that need for reality had become personal. His career was no longer moving in a straight line upward. His addiction to pills had damaged his health, his judgment, and his reputation. There had been arrests, cancellations, instability, public embarrassment. He was still famous, but fame and momentum are not the same thing. Some people in the industry had started to wonder whether Johnny Cash had already had his best years. Cash did not believe that. But belief was not enough anymore. He needed something undeniable, something that would strip away the noise around him and remind the world who he really was. By 1967, the idea of a prison album had stopped being a clever concept and become a necessary one. Cash pushed for it. Producer Bob Johnston believed in it too. Columbia Records was not automatically comfortable with the idea. A prison was not polished. It was not glamorous. It was not safe in the public relations sense of the word. And it was certainly not the obvious place to record a major comeback album. But Cash understood what the label did not. If he made another ordinary live record, it might do respectable business. If he made a prison album, and it worked, it would not feel ordinary at all. It would feel true. And truth was the only thing he could still win with. So on January 13th, 1968, Johnny Cash walked into Folsom State Prison in California to record 2 live shows. He did not come alone. June Carter was there. The Tennessee Three were there. Carl Perkins was there. The Statler brothers were there. It was a serious musical day. But the emotional center of it all was Cash. Everyone knew that. He understood where he was. He also understood what he was not. He was not an inmate. He was not pretending to share every detail of the lives in that room. That is one reason the performance worked so powerfully. He did not talk down to the men in front of him. He did not wrap himself in false brotherhood. He gave them respect. He gave them energy. Most of all, he gave them seriousness. Then he opened with 4 words that became legendary. "Hello, I am Johnny Cash." It was a perfect beginning. Simple, direct, unshaken. The room answered him immediately. That album still sounds alive because the audience was alive. You can hear laughter, tension, recognition, release. When Cash sang Folsom Prison Blues inside Folsom itself, the song changed. It was no longer just a sharp piece of writing from the 1950s. It had found its destination. The famous Reno line landed differently in that room. The train sounded different in that room. Even the silence between the lines felt heavier. And Johnny Cash knew it. He was not merely performing a hit. He was watching one of his own songs become fully real in front of him. One of the most important moments came with Greystone Chapel, a song written by inmate Glen Sherley. Cash had learned it shortly before the concert. By performing it that day, he did something larger than entertainment. He allowed the prison to speak back. For a moment, the record was no longer only about a star entering a prison. It became a record in which the walls themselves had a voice. That mattered. It changed the moral center of the album. It told the audience outside the prison that this was not just scenery. These were human beings. That was the turning point. At Folsom Prison was released later in 1968, and it hit with enormous force. It revived Cash's commercial momentum. It climbed the country charts. It crossed into the pop world. It made him newly relevant to listeners who had begun to drift away. But its deepest impact was personal. Folsom did not simply rescue Johnny Cash's career. It clarified his identity. After Folsom, Johnny Cash was no longer just a successful country singer with a dark edge. He became something larger in the American imagination. He became the man who could stand between worlds, rural and urban, country and rock, faith and failure, respectability and ruin, the free world and the locked one. Folsom gave all of those contradictions a stage. And somehow, Johnny Cash made them feel like one person instead of many fragments. That is why Folsom changed him forever. It proved that his darkness was not a costume. It had meaning. It proved that his sympathy for broken people was not a marketing angle. It was part of how he saw the world. And it proved that when Johnny Cash stopped chasing polish and started chasing truth, he became more powerful than he had ever been in a studio trying to sound controlled. Folsom also changed what he believed his voice was for. In the years that followed, Cash became more outspoken about prison conditions and the humanity of inmates. He carried that concern into interviews, performances, and eventually public testimony in Washington. He was not a perfect activist. He was not a simple political symbol. But he had seen too much by then to go back to using prisons as dramatic scenery alone. Folsom had made the subject real. The timing mattered too. Without Folsom, there may be no San Quentin as we know it. No fully formed Man in Black era. No late 1960s rebirth of Johnny Cash as a national figure who felt larger than genre. Folsom was the hinge. The door swings differently after it. That is the part people often miss. They remember the prison. They remember the applause. They remember the photograph. But what really happened at Folsom was more intimate than that. A man whose life had begun to slip away walked into a room full of men who knew exactly what it meant to lose control of their lives. And for one day, in that room, the performance was honest enough to change everybody involved, including him. Cash did not leave Folsom with a new personality. He left with a sharper version of the one he already had. The version that could hold tenderness and threat in the same voice. The version that could sing about sin without sounding proud of it. The version that could stand before inmates, ministers, hippies, country fans, and politicians, and still feel recognizably like himself. That kind of identity is rare. It usually comes at a cost. For Johnny Cash, one of the places that cost became visible was Folsom Prison. There is another reason the concert endures. It did not feel fake. Not then. Not now. In an industry built on image, Folsom felt like encounter. A real room. A real audience. A real risk. And a performer who knew that if he failed there, the failure would be unmistakable. He did not fail. He met the room at its level, and the room answered back. That exchange is still on the record. That is why people can hear the album decades later and still feel that something more than entertainment is taking place. They are hearing recognition. They are hearing a public image become true enough to survive. Johnny Cash went to Folsom Prison with a song he had written years earlier. He left with a future. That future was not simple. His addictions did not vanish forever. His life did not suddenly become clean and orderly. He remained complicated, restless, contradictory, and human. But after Folsom, the center held more firmly. The world understood something essential about him, and he understood it too. He was at his strongest when he stood closest to the truth. That truth was not only in the lyrics. It was in the setting, in the tension of the room, in the men listening from the other side of the divide, in the fact that Johnny Cash could not charm his way through that day. He had to mean it, and he did. That is why Folsom Prison changed Johnny Cash forever. Not because it created his darkness. That darkness was already there. Not because it invented his empathy. That empathy was already there too. Folsom mattered because it brought those things into alignment. The songs, the voice, the audience, the need. Everything met in the same place at the same time. And when that happens for an artist, the result is more than a successful album. It becomes a defining event. For Johnny Cash, Folsom was not just a comeback. It was a confirmation. A public proof that the version of himself he had been moving toward was real enough to last. That is why the concert still matters to people who were not even alive when it happened. Because they are not only hearing a prison show, they are hearing the moment a legend stops being an image and becomes a fact. By the time later generations found Johnny Cash through television, through San Quentin, through the black suit, through Hurt, or through the mythology that gathered around his name, Folsom had already done its work. It had given him a foundation that felt earned, a foundation built not on polish, but on risk, not on perfection, but on presence, not on distance, but on contact. A man walked into Folsom State Prison carrying the burden of everything he had been. A star in trouble, a performer looking for conviction, a songwriter with one unforgettable prison song already behind him. And when he walked out, he carried something else with him: authority, clarity, a new kind of permanence. Johnny Cash did not become Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, but he became the version of Johnny Cash that history would keep. And that is why Folsom Prison changed him forever.